Hello, and welcome to today's video. For the first time, we are going to be covering a book not written by Michael J. Sullivan, but nonetheless a book that helped shape the world of Elan. We will look at the connections between this book and Elan, and point out some potential connections that may give us insights into the future events of Elan. But before we start, there will be some spoilers for the Riyria Revelations and Legends of the First Empire series. But let's get started. It is no secret that one of the most influential writers to Sullivan was J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien, sometimes referred to as the father of modern fantasy, is best known for the Lord of the Rings trilogy and The Hobbit. In a 2017 tribute to Tolkien, Sullivan wrote, "I owe Tolkien numerous debts. When I was young, adults encouraged reading the same way they prodded me to clean my room and do my homework. I resisted each equally. And yet, on a dreary January day in the early 1970s, I stumbled through a secret door to a magical place in the form of a tattered paperback book with a curious cover. I spent that winter reading The Lord of the Rings. Then I read everything Tolkien wrote. Then I started reading other books and writing stories of my own. Sharing my love of Tolkien fostered bonds with people I'm still friends with 40 years later. Tolkien taught me to read, gave me friends, and then a career. He was my first literary love and has stayed with me my entire life. I still think of Tolkien when I see a gnarled tree's roots, fog on a field, or when walking a winding road." While some of the influence of Tolkien's work on Sullivan is extremely obvious, such as a fantasy world inhabited by elves, dwarves, and humans, our focus today is going to be on one specific book of Tolkien's, the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion is actually a collection of stories by Tolkien that were edited and published after his death. While not as well known as The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, both of which take place in the Third Age of Tolkien's world, the various stories in the Silmarillion cover the creation of the world and the various events that led up to the First, Second, and Third Ages. And we will touch on a couple of these stories today. We start at the very beginning, where Tolkien tells of the creation of the planet, which he calls Arda. This is very interesting that Tolkien chose to do this, as many fantasy series don't go back this far in their lore, even including most epic fantasy series, which is why, the first time I read Sullivan's Legends of the First Empire series, in which we get the creation story of Elan, I immediately thought of the Silmarillion. But going back to Tolkien's creation story, the Silmarillion begins. There was Eru, the One, who in Arda is called Iluvatar, and he made first the Ainur, the Holy Ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. And he spoke to them, propounding to them themes of music, and they sang before him, and he was glad. But for a long while they sang only each alone, or but few together, while the rest hearkened. For each comprehended only that part of the mind of Iluvatar from which he came, and in the understanding of their brethren they grew but slowly. Yet ever as they listened, they came to deeper understanding, and increased in unison and harmony. The story goes on to tell how the Ainur continued to make music, but there is one of the Ainur who is different. To Melkor, among the Ainur had been given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren. He had gone often alone into the void places seeking the imperishable flame, for desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own. Melkor, who would go on to be the main villain in Tolkien's universe, creates dissonance in the music of the Ainur. Multiple times Iluvatar brings back the music, only for Melkor to again sow dissonance. Then finally, in the midst of this strife, whereat the halls of Iluvatar shook, and a tremor ran out into the silences yet unmoved, Iluvatar arose a third time, and his face was terrible to behold. Then he raised up both his hands, and in one chord, deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, piercing as the light of the eye of Iluvatar, the music ceased. It is at this point that Iluvatar shows the Ainur a vision of what the music had created, that being the universe in Arda. Already, we start to see connections between Elan and Arda. In Elan, Troth is known as the Chord of Creation, which is what artists use to create something from nothing, as Trylos explains to Mwandale. Troth is the Chord of Creation. There is no Chord of Creation. Of course there is. How do you think everything was made? The Silmarillion also mentions the Abyss. In that context, the Abyss is referring to the void, or the nothingness outside of time and creation. While this does not match up exactly with what the Abyss is in Pyre, there does seem to be the possibility of some influence on the name. As the story continues in the Silmarillion, we see many of the Ainur go to Arda to craft the world and prepare it for the elves and humans. The greatest of the Ainur that went to Arda would be known as the Valar. Melkor also goes, laying claim to Arda as his own, and would later be known by the name Morgoth, eventually declaring war on his brethren. This war, started by Melkor, greatest of the Ainur, certainly has some parallels to the war started by Turin, the greatest of the Aesira, though undeniably the two wars end very differently, with Melkor eventually losing and being cast out, and Turin eventually winning, but then trying to atone. Now let's jump ahead in the Silmarillion to a story set in the First Age. The title may seem familiar to readers of Sullivan. Turin was the son of Hurin and Morwen. Hurin was a man who went to battle with Morgoth, but was defeated and captured. As a prisoner, Morgoth cursed his family and forced Hurin to sit upon a chair of stone in a high place, and with the use of magic, witness the fall of his kin. Turin would be sent to grow up in Doriath with the elves, and would become a great warrior, though his family's curse would continue to haunt him. He first inadvertently caused the death of an elven counselor, which led him to live as an outlaw. Later, his elven friend Beleg, who was a great bowman, would come join him, and they would create a band of warriors to fight Morgoth's forces. After being betrayed by a dwarf, Turin would be captured, but Beleg would be able to save him. Unfortunately, while Beleg was cutting Turin's bonds, he nicked Turin's foot, and Turin, mistaking Beleg for an orc, killed his friend. Turin would then leave and end up in the elven fortress of Narthrond, where he would become influential, but his actions would eventually lead to the downfall of the fortress to the forces of Morgoth and Glaurung, the first dragon of Arda. Turin would then start over in Brethil. One night, while scouting in the woods, he found a woman with no memory, who would be called Niniel, who he would later marry. While his wife was with child, news came that Glaurung, the dragon, was near Brethil, so Turin set out to kill the dragon. He hid in a ravine and waited for the dragon to climb over top. He then stabbed the beast in the belly, mortally wounding Glaurung, and then falling unconscious due to the potent blood of the dragon. When Niniel came searching for her husband, the dragon used his final breath to reveal to Niniel that she was actually Turin's sister. Being overcome with despair, she leaps into the ravine to her death. When Turin comes to, he is told of what had happened. After killing the first man who tells him in disbelief, the story is confirmed, and Turin finally takes his own life with his sword. The story of Turin is certainly not the happiest tale Tolkien ever wrote. While the story of Turin Turambar doesn't seem to have many similarities to Sullivan's Turin, there are some interesting connections. In Sindarin, one of Tolkien's Elvish languages, Turin means he who desires mastery or power, which certainly would have been accurate for Sullivan's Turin in his earlier years when he warred with the other Aesira. Both Turins also went by many different names in their stories, Turin being known as Nathan, Gorthal, Agavain, Mormagal, Wildman of the Woods, and Turambar, while Turin going by Rex Uberlin, Malcolm, Nimbus, Kyle, Nim, and more. We must also mention Turin Turambar's sword, which he eventually killed himself with. His sword is called Girthang, meaning Iron of Death. Girthang was actually a reforged version of Beleg's sword, which Turin took after Beleg's death. Beleg's sword was named Anlachel, which means Iron of the Flaming Star. It was named this as it was forged from a meteorite. There is a similar sword in Elan. What do you know about Silmarillion, Rain? What everyone does, that it was forged by the master, Andvari Burling, from a bit of star that had fallen from the sky. This is of course King Midian's sword that Rain takes back from Pyre. It is interesting that Turin Turambar dies by a meteoric blade, as there have been theories that Silmarillion, being both part of Eton and Elan, may be able to kill the immortal Turin. This would certainly be an intriguing parallel. And, as another Easter egg here, Andvari Burling, the creator of Silmarillion, is actually the namesake of a dwarf from Norse mythology named Andvari, who had a cursed ring, which would lead to Tolkien's inspiration for the One Ring in The Lord of the Rings. One final note about Turin Turambar. The original version of the Silmarillion stated that Morgoth would return in the last days of Arda for the final battle, Dagor Dagorath. And in this battle, it would be Turin Turambar reincarnated who would kill Morgoth with Girthang, finally avenging his family. On the flip side, Golrock, which is the final battle which has been foretold on Elan, certainly will involve Turin, as Elan states, "For the Golrock, it is believed that Turin will unlock Pyre." And Trylos states, "He is evil and must be destroyed. That's what the Golrock is for." The last battle of the First War will see the death of Turin, and I plan to bring it about. Now we head to the Second Age of Arda, to the final story of the Silmarillion we will cover, the story of Numenor. The Numenorians were humans who had aided the elves in defeating Morgoth at the end of the First Age, and so the Valar granted the humans the island of Numenor, as well as wisdom, power, and long lives. Sauron, who had been the lieutenant of Morgoth, was now the Dark Lord, and the Numenorians, being so powerful, moved against him. They took him prisoner, but Sauron was able to influence the Numenorian king, making him envious of the immortality of the elves and the Valar. And after years of manipulation, the Numenorians sailed to attack the Valar. This is the same tactic that Trylos used on King Midian, convincing the Belga Glungrians to attack the Frey, thinking they had Alluria's fruit, which could grant immortality. Back to our story, the Valar called out to Iluvatar for help, and once the Numenorians reached the shores of the Valar, Iluvatar created a giant chasm in the sea, and all the ships were swallowed up, and the island of Numenor was sunk under the water. The fate of this pinnacle city of humankind seems similar to the fate of the first city of Erebus on Elan, which is described through Bryn's sight in the garden. Bryn watched as the shadow play on the wall continued. The silhouette of the man sat to one side, as in the background, Bryn witnessed the destruction of a great and noble city. Towering buildings tilted and fell. The ground shook and broke. Water from the sea rushed in, flooding everything. people fled. While we do not know the final state of Erebus, or even where its exact location is, there is speculation we will learn this in the upcoming 2023 book, Esarhaddon. It may even reside under the sea. And that completes the stories we will discuss from the Silmarillion. But there are two other interesting connections I will mention. In a 1951 letter from Tolkien to Milton Waldman concerning the Silmarillion, Tolkien stated of the elves, "Their magic is art, delivered from many of its human limitations, more effortless, more quick, more complete, product and vision in unflawed correspondence." This is an interesting connection, as the Frey, starting with Fenelaus, referred to their magic as the art, though this connection seems superficial. Secondly, in that same letter, Tolkien stated, "The doom, or the gift, of men is mortality, freedom from the circles of the world. Since the point of view of the whole cycle is the elvish, mortality is not explained mythically. It is a mystery of God of which no more is known than that what God has purposed for men is hidden, a grief and an envy to the immortal elves." This idea that mortality is a gift is well accepted in Tolkien's works, and seems to echo in Sullivan's, as the two immortal beings, Turin and Muriel, certainly have come to view their immortality not as a gift. Well, that wraps up this video. I almost feel bad with how brief my summaries of the Silmarillion stories were and how much I had to leave out in order to condense them. So I definitely recommend reading the Silmarillion if anyone is a fan of Tolkien's works. And I also will post some links in the description of other videos that go through some of those stories I touched on, but in much better detail. Lastly, if you know of any other connections between Tolkien's and Sullivan's works, let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Be sure to subscribe and watch my other videos to learn more about the world of Elan and Riyria. Thanks!